The dream comes to him again, and it says, your intentions are good, you want to be a good person, you want to serve God, your actions are not correct. So after having this dream repeatedly, and we know from the Torah that if a dream gets repeated, that's significant. Where do we know that from? That's exactly. Pharaoh tells Joseph, I had a dream twice. Joseph says, aha. He says the fact that the dream happened twice is significant. Once, you can pass off coincidence, too much pastrami, whatever, right? But he says, you have the dream a few times, that tells me that there's some message here. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi relates the story that this king had this dream, and so the king decides he will get representatives of different philosophies to present to him what he should be doing. If his actions are falling short of what God wants, if he's not doing the right thing, let's try and figure out what the right thing is. So, thank God, they didn't have Prozac then, because we would never have had this book. Well, he would have just said, oh, it's bothering me, let's take something and I'll forget about it. So he didn't do that. He decided to investigate. So the first person he calls is a representative of Greek philosophy. And he has a long discussion with the philosopher, and he rejects the philosopher's view, because the philosopher in the end says there is no such thing as an absolutely good action or an absolutely evil action. There's no such thing. He rejected the idea of absolute morality. He said he says what you need to do as king, you just need to adopt whatever religion will be most effective in keeping your people in check. Right? You want to keep your people in check. Plato says this in the Republic, that it's not important what religion it is, as long as it's something where, people will be kept in check and you'll be able to administer your country well. And ideally, what you should be striving for is to be the ultimate philosopher, to be a great thinker. You'll need like a pool of women, a harem, so that you'll satisfy yourself, as Plato says. You need a serving class, you need a servile class of slaves, so you don't have to worry about menial labour, as Plato also says. He says, and then the top people, the top level of the pyramid, they will be the philosophers. And he says that's what will achieve your goal. So the king rejects the philosophy. He says, this has not really made me feel very good. You haven't answered my question. What's his objection? His objection is this. The philosopher is missing out something, because instinctive within people is a belief that there is an absolute good and an absolute evil. We may disagree on what those goods and evils are, but the idea that there is some type of absolute, that's almost universal in human nature. It's an amazing thing. Even people who claim not to believe in anything absolutely, communists and socialists, is it not true that people gave up their lives for communism? Does that make any sense? What is communism? It's an economic theory. They don't believe in the world to come. They don't believe in the soul. They don't believe in an absolute truth. They just believe this is a good economic theory. So you're going to give up your life for a good economic theory? Does that make any sense? But people do that because deep down, that's their God. That's their God. That's their absolute. So they're worshipping it. So the king rejects the philosopher. He then says to himself, I will now get representatives of the two great monotheistic religions, because I'm already a pagan, so polytheism is obviously out. So I've got to go for the two great monotheistic religions, Christianity and Islam. And he says, as for the Jews, you know what? Irrelevant. They're irrelevant. Why, he says? They are downtrodden, universally despised, and in exile, so obviously they're wrong. So obviously it must be either the Christians or the Muslims. So he gets a Christian philosopher, a Christian called in the original Arabic a doctor of Christianity. He has this doctor of Christianity come and presents his arguments. He says, we believe in everything written in the 5 books of Moses and in the prophets that followed him. We believe in the revelation of Sinai. However, things evolved. Eventually the divine form came into the body of a human being, a child born to a Jewish virgin, and Mary, and this became Jesus. And he says, even though we talk about a Trinity, Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, we really mean that it's a one unity. It's divided into 3, as Bishop Athanasius points out, that it's the 3 parts of the Godhead, and it's really one, but it really is 3, and of course it becomes what he calls a divine mystery. And he presents his view to the king. The king rejects this as well. He says, you've asking me to believe something which is irrational. He says, if I'd grown up with the belief that God became a little baby soiling his diapers, born to a Jewish virgin, he says, maybe, if I grew up with it, I could accept it. But you're asking me to accept such an idea, a bizarre concept of that sort? I can't do it. I can't do it. I need some evidence. He says, well, the evidence is in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. He says, no, but that's not evidence about Jesus. That's not evidence about the virgin birth. That's not evidence about what you're saying. He says, I find it very hard to believe. So he rejects the Christian. This is, by the way, this whole debate is recorded in this book, the Kuzari, by Rabbi Levi. Then he gets the Muslim. The Muslim starts off by saying, we believe in everything in the 5 books of Moses and in the prophets that follow. Of course, he says, the prophets do not end with Malachi, the last of the prophets in the Old Testament. They did not end with Jesus, who they believed to be a prophet as well. But they ended with Muhammad, the seal of the prophets. And he, with his revelation of God giving him the Quran, he said, and now the king, the Quran doesn't contain all the irrationalities of the Trinity. It's purely monotheistic. It doesn't contain belief in the virgin birth. So the king says, well, the Quran sounds interesting. He says, what's your evidence that it's true? Because really, ultimately, you're relying on the word of Muhammad. Muhammad said he got it from God. Maybe, maybe not. So here, and he quotes something from a surah. It's one of the chapters in the Quran where the Quran says evidence of the divinity of the Quran is the fact that it is so beautiful. It is so poetic. It is so deep. And the author himself, as a human being, was not very well educated, and it's inconceivable that he could have written something so beautiful without it being divinely inspired. That's the evidence that he presents, and the king does not like that. The king says, I'm sorry. He says, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It is subjective. There are people who like Russian novels. I can't understand it, but there are people who like that, right? I mean, where Oblomov or whatever, it takes him 50 pages to get out of bed, right? And that's when the novel actually starts. Unbelievable, right? I once saw a New Yorker magazine. The New Yorker had these great cartoons. New Yorker has the best cartoons, I think. So you see this guy standing on a stack of paper about that high with a noose around his neck. And it says, Russian author on his suicide note. He's going to jump off it. So, but I digress. So anyway, as it happens, my wife studied Russian language and literature as a minor in college. So, but whatever. But she's not watching this. Right. So you see, what's beautiful, not beautiful. That's not evidence. So he doesn't like. So the king says, I have no choice. I've got to ask the Jews. The Christians are referring to the Jewish Bible. The Muslims are referring to the Jewish Bible. Even the philosopher made reference to the Jewish Bible. He says, what choice do I have? I have to get a Jew. So he gets a Jew, who's traditionally known as Rabbi Yitzchak HaSangeri, which either means Rabbi Yitzchak of Sangria, somewhere in Spain, or it also means in Aramaic, Sanegor also means what's a Sanegor? A defense attorney, as in fide defensor, defender of the faith. So whether it's an actual name of where he came from or his title, we don't know. So this Rabbi Yitzchak, the rabbi presents the case for Judaism, and he sparks the interest of the king. And the king eventually, he says, after this, the Kuzari, as is related in the history of the Khazars, was anxious to reveal to his vizier in the mountains of Warsan the secret of his dream, in which he was asked to seek the God-pleasing deed. The king and his vizier travelled to the deserted mountains on the seashore. They came to a cave in which there were Jews celebrating the Shabbat, and there he converted to Judaism. He comes back to his country, and he and his vizier, his prime minister, both converted to Judaism, and they influenced the rest of their family to convert to Judaism. The rest of the court now converts to Judaism. Once the king and his court are Jewish, they now impact the rest of the country, and most of the people in the country eventually become Jewish. And the bulk of the book is not about the Khazars at all. The bulk of the book is Jewish philosophy, in which the rabbi and the king have a conversation. So the first few chapters are about the philosopher, the Muslim, and the Christian, and the rest of the 98% of the book is the rabbi. Rabbis can talk much more than anyone else. So the whole book is the rabbi and the king debating. And it starts off as debate, and eventually the king grows more and more familiar with Judaism, and the questions become more detailed. By the end of the book, the king is asking questions about Kabbalah and the meaning of the names of God and intricate aspects of Hebrew grammar. In other words, there's a fascinating progress to see in the relationship of the king to Judaism. He starts off as the cynic. He then starts to accept it. He becomes a believer. He converts to Judaism. He's got basic questions about Jewish philosophy, Jewish practice. Why do Jews do this? Why do you do that? Etc. He obviously learns more Torah. The questions become more complex. By the end of the book, the questions are questions that I can't even understand some of the questions, let alone the answers. Right? So that's the book, the Kuzari. So it's a fascinating story. Now, what I want to discuss first of all here is, did this actually happen? Did the Khazars convert to Judaism? Interesting, just want to point out something here. He says, at the end of this paragraph, the Kuzari, I'll say it in English first, I found among the arguments of the rabbi many which appealed to me and were in harmony with my own opinions. I resolved to write them down as they had been spoken. Now that sounds like Rabbi Yehuda Levi is claiming that he's got a transcript of the debate and he's just transcribing it, correct? But there's a couple of words he adds in the Hebrew that make me think otherwise. In the Hebrew it says, Variti lichtov advarim hahem kasher naflu. I decided to write these words as they fell to me. V'amaskilim yavinu. Those who are those who are wise will understand. And some of the commentaries say what he means to say here is, if you're wise, you'll understand this is not a transcript. I'm using this as a vehicle to convey my understanding of Judaism. Okay. So most historians, most commentaries say it's not a transcript, and the truth is I'm much more comfortable that it's not a transcript. Because Rabbi Yehuda Levi, I know who he is, I know his pedigree, we know his greatness, we know his expertise, and consequently I'm much more comfortable. I don't know this other rabbi, anonymous rabbi, I don't know. So I much prefer that it's from Yehuda Levi than not. However, what I'd like to look at is, did this actually happen? So let's have a look. First of all, where is Khazaria? So as you'll see here, you see there the Khazar Empire. There's the Black Sea, right? There is Bulgar, right? Khanate. There is Finnish tribes. That's what we call that area now. At that time, was called Rus. It was not called Russia yet. It was called Rus, the Rusim, right? And there is the Khazar. As you can see, it's huge. Khazar Empire is a large empire. These were people known as Turkic people in the Khazar Empire. Turkic, not Turkish, but Turkic. Here is a close-up map of the Khazar Empire. As you see here, this was the expanded kingdom, that was the smaller kingdom, but it's a large kingdom. As you can see here, the Magyars, who are the people who emigrated to Hungary, they're the Hungarians, right? The origins of the Hungarians. You've got the Bulgarians over here, and some of the names, you might recognise some of the names here, but that's the Khazar kingdom. Now, the Khazar kingdom was a very, very powerful kingdom. They were very great traders, a lot of trade, and also powerful militarily. The Khazars had a fearsome reputation on a military level. That is a picture from the 13th century, 11th century, of a Khazar soldier with one of his captives. So he's got him by the hair and he's like riding along the horse. So we're talking about the conversion, by the way, according to Rabbi Yehuda Levi, the conversion happened around 800. Rabbi Yehuda Levi lived about 400 years later, in the 1200s. Conversion happened in the 800s. So this is what the Khazars looked like in the 800s. This is interesting. This is an artist's depiction of a Khazar horseman based on recovered Khazarian artifacts. And this is from after the 8th century. This is probably from the 9th or 10th century. Do you notice something about this Khazar horseman? Yes. He's got peyot. He's got peyot. That's fascinating, right? So a 10th century picture of a Khazar horseman should have peyot. I know it's hard to see here, but this is a drinking horn from Mogila, which is actually on the Chinese border. And I don't know if it's hard to see here, but here apparently is a Khazar. And also this Khazar has a beard and has peyot as well. So the Chinese, the border of Mongolia, their encounters with the Khazars, they also depicted them on this glass thing as having peyot. So a little circumstantial evidence here. Here is a 9th century Khazar coin inscribed with Moses is the messenger of God. And here's a Khazar coin with the very obvious Star of David. This is a Khazar city, which is the city of Sarkel. which is mentioned, was just recently, it was not, a lot of the excavations of the Khazars were not done under the communists. In fact, there was a lot of suppression of Khazar studies under the communists. Why do you think that is so?
They want connection to Judaism.
Exactly. They did not want to have any connection to Judaism. It would be very uncomfortable to know that there was a powerful independent Jewish empire in the middle of Russia in the 9th, 10th and 11th centuries, and that some Russian culture may actually come from the Jews. This is not something which the communists were interested in exposing, so there was not a lot of archaeological excavations. But here we have some fascinating accounts here. This is actually from a Christian historian written in 864. This is what he writes. At the present time, we know of no nation under the heavens where Christianity does not live. Where Christians do not live. Christians are even found in the lands of Gog or Magog, who are a Hunnic race and are called the Khazars, circumcised and observing all the laws of Judaism. So we have a Christian in 864 telling us that there are these people called the Khazars in the land of Gog or Magog. By the way, Gog or Magog is the biblical evil empire, which is like the Amalekites. But anyway, so they're living in the... So he talks about the fact... by the way, he mentions that there are people in the Khazars who are circumcised and observe the laws of Judaism. And then we turn to the Muslims. A very famous Muslim traveller and writer writes in the 10th century, all of the Khazars are Jews, but they have been Judaized recently. Because when did they become Jewish? In the middle of the 9th century. He's writing in the 10th century. So he says, yes, they're Jews, but they were Judaized recently. Here is Abd al-Jabbar ibn Muhammad al-Hamdani, an 11th century work in which he tries to bring evidence for the authenticity of the Quran. In the work, he says, one of the Jews undertook the conversion of the Khazars, who are composed of many peoples, and they were converted by him and joined his religion. This happened recently in the days of the Abbasids. So he claims, in fact, it's interesting, both of the Arab sources here, both the Muslim sources claim that the Jews actively proselytized the Khazars. We don't know, right? But according to the story, Rabbi Levi brings quotes, it's not a proselytization. The king asked the Jews. We didn't ask him, right? And generally, it has not been the practice of Jews to go out and proselytize. You don't have people going to Christian neighborhoods in Missouri, yeshiva guys saying, hello, are you interested in the Talmud? Right? It's not a common thing, right? Doesn't happen, right? You do have people from Missouri coming to my door asking if I'm interested in Christianity. That happens, right? But not the other way around. But again, the Muslims talk about these people being Judaized and converted by the Jews. There's a man who came single-handedly to a king of great rank and very spirited people. They were converted by him without any recourse to violence and the sword. He mentions this with some surprise, because how did people generally get converted to Islam? By the sword. It wasn't like the Muslims came in and had a seminar. It was like the Muslim came in and said, it's jihad, welcome, right, etc. So, and they took upon themselves the difficult obligations enjoined by the laws of the Torah, such as circumcision, prohibition of work on Sabbath and the feasts, and the prohibition of eating flesh of forbidden animals, and so on. And here we have a description from Kiev, it's called the Rus Chronicles, one of the oldest chronicles from Russia. And the Rus Chronicles talk about the Khazar Jews came to the court of Prince Vladimir and said they tried to convert. Here, the Khazars, who are new Jews. So new Jews tend to sometimes be a little more enthusiastic than the rest of us, you know what I mean? Yeah. So they come to the court of King Vladimir in Kiev and try to convince him to become Jewish. So we have a fair amount of... This is not circumstantial evidence anymore, folks. Here are Arab, Muslim, Christian, and Russian historians who are writing historical accounts of the Jewish Khazars. So evidently, the Khazars indeed became Jewish. And in the greatest evidence of the Khazars' Judaism came in 1912. This is the New York Times from November 17th, 1912. You can buy on the internet copies of the New York Times from all the archives throughout history. It's like $2, $3. So anyway, this is the New York Times from November 1912. And what happened here is, remember we spoke about the discovery of the Cairo Gniza right? The very famous Solomon Schechter, who eventually became one of the ideologues of the conservative movement in the United States. So Solomon Schechter, when he was in Cambridge, made some fascinating discoveries of the manuscripts of the Jews in Cairo. Some of those discoveries were these letters, fragments dug from forgotten library rubbish heaps, and just translated by Dr. Solomon Schechter, tell of a powerful European kingdom of the Khazars century after the destruction of the Jewish state in Palestine. So the New York Times, wow, there's this Jewish state. I mean, in 1912, the only people who were thinking of a Jewish state, Herzl, had been thinking of a Jewish state. We had the political Zionist movement. And here, Solomon Schechter finds evidence of a powerful, military, Jewish, independent Jewish country in the middle of Europe. Fascinating stuff. So the New York Times published this. It's actually a lengthy article. You obviously can't read it here, but whatever. But here, in the Jewish Quarterly Review, which someone I know in Lakewood has every single copy of it from the 1800s until now. So he showed me a copy, volume 3, 1912, 1913, in the original article that was published by Solomon Schechter. What did he find there? He found correspondence between the Jews of Khazar and the Jews of Cairo, and the Jews of Khazar and the Jews of Spain. So you could not get better than that. So we've got Christian, Muslim and Russian historians writing about the Jewish Khazars. We have Khazar soldiers with peyot, and now we have correspondence in the ancient library of Cairo between the Khazar convert Jews in Khazaria and the Jews of Egypt and the Jews of Spain. So here's one of the letters. This is actually written in Hebrew, and the Khazar Jew is actually, it's called the Schechter letter. This Khazar Jew is describing to his fellow Jews in Egypt what happened to them. He talks about the conversion to Judaism. He talks about their struggles, etc., etc. And you can read, it's actually written in Hebrew, it's not in Arabic, because the language of the Khazars was not Arabic, it was Turkic. The language of the Jews in Egypt was Arabic. The language of the Jews in Spain was primarily Arabic. So he would be writing in Hebrew to make it known so all Jews could understand it. And here is a letter from the Khazar Jews. So when that came out, that really provided one of the greatest pieces of evidence for the idea of this Khazar Jewish nation. Here is a letter from the Cairo Geniza, and this was discovered later. And this actually is a letter from the Khazars to one of the leaders of the Spanish Jews, Chazdai ibn Shafrut. Chazdai ibn Shafrut was a scholar and a statesman and an economist, and he was one of the most important Jews in Spain, and there is correspondence between him and the Jews of Khazar, and there's a fascinating exchange of letters between one of the kings of the Khazars, whose name is Yosef, and the Jews of Spain. So we have this fascinating phenomenon of an independent Jewish nation, militarily powerful, in the middle of Europe, from around the middle of the 9th century, who they disappeared, they were conquered by the Russians in the middle of the 12th century, 13th century. And that was, but for a period of a few hundred years, you had a Jewish country, and they were in correspondence with Jews in other parts of the world, Jews in Spain, Jews in Egypt, and they're also in correspondence with, and actually had trade with Jews in other parts of the world. Here is another letter. This is one of the oldest letters from the Jews of Europe. This is actually from Kiev. The Jews of Kiev are writing a letter to the Jews of Cairo in Egypt. And this actually dates back to the 11th century. And here, what's fascinating about this letter is, in the letter, it's signed by a number of Jews in the Kiev community. And a number of them have Khazar names. So they're Jews, but they've got Khazar names. And at the bottom of the letter's written in Hebrew, but at the bottom of the letter, you see there? I've enlarged it. That is actually Turkic Khazar script, and it says, I've read it. In other words, I guess some Khazar signed that, read the letter. It's like putting an OK on a memo, right? And that's what he did. And so we have a combination of the Jews, Kievan Jews, born in Kiev, and Khazar Jews who are living with the Kievan Jewish community, and they're writing to their fellow Jews in Cairo, and it's a combination both of Hebrew, original Hebrew names, Khazar Jewish names, and also Khazar script on this letter. Here is from a Chinese tomb, and this is a figure of a Khazar horseman. It's hard to see here, but archaeologists claim that it has Semitic features. Who knows? In any case, here. Okay, so these are some Khazar graves from much later in history. And now, what happened to the Khazars? So the Khazars, basically, as I said, were conquered by the Rus, by the Russians, and they dispersed. Some of them remained in Khazaria, but many of them integrated into the Jewish communities in Turkey and in Poland and in Russia. Now, and there is some interesting influence of the Khazars on our language and other aspects. For example, this is a conjecture. This is Kevin Allen Brooke in his book on the Khazars, Princeton University. And Kevin Allen Brooke maintains that there are a number of words. For instance, when we say daven, Yiddish, davenen, what does davenen mean in Yiddish? You go to daven to pray. What's the origin of this word? In Hebrew, prayer is tefillah. Okay, in German, to pray is, it's not daven. It's not daven. Right? So where's this come? So he maintained in the Turkic, which is the Khazar language, dabundum, or tabun, means to pray.
But in French it's diviner.
Diviner, meaning from the divine.
Right. So when I studied Yiddish, they were talking about the French influence, and they pointed to the word daven comes from diviner.
That's possible. I said it's conjecture, but he maintains that it actually comes from dabundem, which means I prayed, and daven. There's very few words in Yiddish from the French, right? There are some, but not a lot. Lokshen. Lokshen means what? What's lokshen? Pasta, noodles, right? So actually in Turkic, laksha are noodles. Laksha. Right? Yarmulke. Now, in traditional Jewish texts, you find that usually they explain yarmulke as a composed of two words in Aramaic. Yarei Malka, which means fear the king, fear God. But probably, very possible that it can come, he maintains, comes from Yagmulurk, which is a rain cover or a head covering in Turkic, in Khazar. Kaftan, which is a long overgarment in Turkic. And here are some names. Alpert or Alperovitz is a Khazar surname, and he's hero. Alpert is a hero. Alperovitz is son of a hero.
I studied medieval Jewish history with David Berger, and he said that Alpert, Rappaport, and a couple others come from Portugal. Alperto means from Portugal. He explained how Rappaport also has a relationship to Portugal.
Rappaport may. Alpert, however, Khazars are much closer to Russia than Portugal. And it's quite possible, David Berger is a world-leading authority, but the claim here is that Alpert actually is not from Portugal, but actually, because it actually appears in Khazar documents before then, right, well before. So Kagan, as a surname, Kagan means king, right? Balaban, which is a Jewish surname, Balaban actually means falcon in Turkic, and Kaplan, which is, Kaplan means tiger in Turkic. Again, there are other interpretations of these names, and
chaplain.
It could be, right? Again, there are alternatives, right? And I can't prove any of these. Kevin Allen Brooke maintains that these are of Turkic origin. Could be not. Another interesting aspect is you look at the Polish synagogues. Polish synagogues show a very, very distinct. These of course all been burnt to the ground. I just got back from Poland last week. There's very few synagogues left in Poland. Certainly all the old magnificent wooden synagogues of Poland, very beautiful. But they show, according to Henry Abramson, he did a study of the Polish synagogues, wooden Polish synagogues. He maintains that that there's a Middle Asian influence on these synagogues, which may very well come from the Khazars. Could be. Again, so the Khazars, again, before I get to Arthur Koestler, right, so one thing, what do we know for sure? What do we know definitely? That there was a Khazar nation, that they were identified by Christians, Muslims, and Rus as being Jews, that they corresponded with the Jewish communities in Spain and in Egypt. And they were known to have converted to Judaism. We don't really have any sources as to why they converted. In other words, the only source as to why is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and that may be he just created that legend because purpose of his book. But it could be that that's what happened. Why would they convert? On the other hand, you have to think of it from the other perspective. If it didn't happen, as Rabbi Yehuda Halevi said, why would they convert? Why did this whole nation, much of this nation, convert to Judaism? So a lot of them converted because the ruling class converted. But why did the ruling class convert? So there are different theories about this. Some say, one of the most bizarre theories, actually, I saw this in Judaica, Encyclopedia Judaica, is that they'd recently been attacked by the Muslims. So it was a way of thumbing their nose at the Muslims. Maybe. Right? Another theory is they did not want to get involved in the wars between the Christians and the Muslims, so they became Jewish. Now, I don't know if that's a very safe strategy to me. Jews tend to get, you know what I mean? But whatever, maybe it was a way of being neutral in that war. Maybe it could be. I don't know the politics of that time. It could have been a way of being neutral in those disputes. There are some who say that it was the influence of Jewish traders. Many Jewish traders made their way into Khazaria, and it was their influence that the Khazars converted to Judaism. That may be, although you'd have to ask, were there no Christian traders or Muslim traders? Maybe the Jews did a lot of trade, so it may be their influence. To me, again, I don't have any evidence for this, but Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's story, which is that the king kept having the recurrent dream and had the debate, and there is reference to a debate in some of these letters. It doesn't say explicitly that was the cause of the conversion, but to me, I like it. It rings true to me. I choose to believe that that's it. But again, one thing we do know is the Khazar nation. They converted to Judaism, and it's very possible that some of us are descended from them. Some of us, I say. Because there was a fellow by the name of Arthur Koestler, who maybe you have heard of him, the 13th tribe. If you actually Google Khazars, most of the websites you'll get to are anti-Semitic.
Really?
Yes. Why? Because
they want to say that the Jews of Europe were basically the Khazars, and they weren't.
You got it. You got it. About 90% of the websites you'll get to on Khazars, anti-Semitic. Why? Because they're saying we are not the descendants of the Israelites. The European Jews are not the descendants of the biblical Israelites. On the contrary, we are Khazar interlopers. We're all, and Arthur Koestler, in his famous book called The 13th Tribe, or infamous book, he actually advanced this theory, and it was quite popular, that the Jews, the European Jews, were basically all descended from the Khazars. Now, there's a few problems here. And this is what he writes. He says, I just want to just go back here. He says, I'm aware of the danger that it may maliciously misinterpret as a denial of the state of Israel to exist. Not just a danger, because virtually every Arab website, Muslim website about this will say the Jews don't deserve Israel because they're not the biblical Israelites, they're Khazars. They're from Europe. Now, of course, the fact is about a little less than half the population of Israel are Jews from where? Egypt, Iraq, Iran, right, etc. Are these Khazars? Of course. We're from the Middle East, right? Half of Israel. Because that they conveniently forget about in all of this stuff. Right? But even the European Jews, right, it's fascinating. And he writes, he says, I know this will be misused, and so on and so forth. And he tries to write a little bit of this is in the second edition of the book, he saw how it was misused by neo-Nazis and anti-Semites and the Palestinian terrorists, etc. So he says, obviously, as I've argued elsewhere, the long-term solution of the paradox can only be immigration to Israel or gradual assimilation to their host nations. Etc. Before the Holocaust, the process was in full swing. In 1975, Time magazine reported that American Jewries tend to marry outside their faith at a high rate. Almost 1/3 of all marriages are mixed. Nevertheless, the lingering influence of Judaism's racial and historical message, though based on an illusion, acts as a powerful emotional brake by appealing to tribal loyalty. So he had some very strong statements to say in his book, and he misused it. Now, I think we should point out, here, this is actually from an Arab website. It's called the Free Arab Voice, and it's by Tawfiq Abdul Fattah, 1997. And he talks about once upon a time in ancient Khazaria, the entire kingdom converted to Judaism. Arthur Koestler, a Jew, because they love when a Jew does this type of stuff. It's like the best person to quote. A Jew born in 1905 in Budapest wrote the Khazars flourished, etc., etc. They were located to major world powers, and he says, obviously, the king's motives in adopting Judaism purely political. The bulk of modern Jewry is not of Palestinian, but of Caucasian origin. Koestler writes, their ancestors came not from Jordan, but from the Volga, not from Canaan, but from the Caucasus. So, of course, the Muslims love Koestler, the neo-Nazis love Koestler, every anti-Semitic conspiracy website loves Koestler, and the European Jews are not Jewish. Of course, there's been a lot of genetic research about the Jews, and which Koestler did not have available in his time, and a lot of the genetic research has been very, very helpful in our case. For example, the main ethnic element of Ashkenazim, Sfardim, Mizrahim, Yehurim, which are the mountain Jews, and Italkim, and most other modern Jewish population of the world is Israelite. In other words, if you look at Jews, the genes of Jews of German and Eastern Europe, Spain and Portugal, Middle East, and the mountain Jews of the Caucasus, like the Bukharans, etc., and the Italian Jews, you'll find they all have a common Israelite genes. Which, just that fact alone, is enough to completely knock off Koestler. Not to say there are not some of us, like myself, with the very, very, the Russell Crowe type appearance, right, of myself, right? So maybe I'm descended from Khazar converts. Who knows? That could very well be. I know everyone always says it. It's like something. Anyway. But whatever. So the Israeli haplotype falls into DNA haplogroups, etc. East Ashkenazim, European Ashkenazim also descend in a smaller way from European peoples from the northern Mediterranean region, and even less from Slavs and Khazars. So, again, Georgian Jews, mix of Georgian and Israelites. Yemenite Jews, Yemenite Arabs and Israelites. Moroccan Jews, Algerian Jews, mainly Israelites. Libyan Jews, mainly Israelites. B'nai Israel Jews and Cochin Jews. A lot of Indian ancestry. Palestinian Arabs, probably partly Israelite, very likely. Right? So, again, the genetic evidence seems to be very strong for the common ancestry of the Jews. In fact, even after this was published, you have what's called the Kohen modal haplotype. You've heard of that? Mm-hmm. A test was done to determine if Kohanim, who were claimed to be descendant of Aaron, so they did tests on Jews who were Kohanim from Europe, from Israel, from England, from the United States, and they found that in the males there was what they called a CMH, the Kohen modal haplotype, which was like a marker in the genes that indicated a common ancestry of all these people. So again, would be further evidence in the idea of the Jews being the Jews. Now, the fact of the matter is, Patai, the myth of the Jewish race, one should remember the Khazars were described by several contemporary authors as having a pale complexion, blue eyes and reddish hair. Red, as distinguished from blonde hair, is found in a certain percentage of East European Jews. This also, and this as well as more generalised light colouring, could be a heritage of the medieval Khazarian fusion. Raphael Patai maintains that, there's a certain Jewish red hair. You ever seen that? It's like Jewish red hair. Okay, so I was actually at this hotel in Lublin, and the lady at the reception desk had this stunning Jewish red hair, and but she didn't look Jewish at all, and she was speaking Polish. Then I went into the dining room. It was a kosher hotel in Krakow, not Lublin, in Krakow, and someone else had the same hair, and I said, "Is that your sister?" She says, "No, we both dye it." So whatever, but whatever. But something we have to point out. One of the major flaws in this whole idea of proving where our DNA comes from and our race, etc., I think is deeply flawed. Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs puts it very beautifully. He says this: Judaism is not an ethnicity, and Jews are not an ethnic group. Go to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, you'll see Jews of every colour and culture under the sun. The Becher Israel from Ethiopia, B'nai Israel from India, Bukharan Jews from Central Asia, Iraqi, Berber, Egyptian, Kurdish, Libyan, Taymanim from Yemen, alongside American Jews from Russia, South African Jews from Lithuania, British Jews from German-speaking Poland. Food, music, dress, customs and conventions are all different. Jewishness is not an ethnicity, but a living lexicon of ethnicities. He puts it so beautifully. But you see, the original Jews were not one ethnic group. Think about it. The 12 tribes of Israel came from Samaria. Okay? Who did they marry? Joseph married an Egyptian. According to many sources, the other tribes, Judah married a Canaanite. The other tribes married Canaanites. Moses married a woman from a place called Cush. Some translators Ethiopia. Maybe, maybe not, but certainly not Israelite. Joshua married Rachav from Jericho. Joshua marries Rachav from Jericho. So the original Jews, go back as far as you want, all the way to the biblical times, the original Jews were the Rainbow Coalition. We were a completely, that's a fact, that we were an ethnically diverse group. And if you look today, yes, of course, the genetic tests are very handy to be able to refute Kosler and the anti-Semites. True. But the DNA is not it. Right? We are Jews because we're all part of this covenant called the Torah. As Rav Sa'adjagan put it, Ein umatenu uma ela b'torata. Our nation is only a nation by virtue of its Torah. And that's how he puts it. Now, Maimonides was asked by a convert to Judaism who asked, he says, there's a man who was an Arab, a Muslim, by the name, and he converted to Judaism, and he took on the name Ovadia. Ovadia, who was one of the prophets. They often, converts took the name Ovadia because Ovadia himself was a convert. One of our prophets was a convert from the nation of Edom. One of the enemies of the Jewish people, but he became a convert and he became a prophet, and he's got one of the books of the Bible. It's called Ovadia. So this Ovadia asks Maimonides the following question. He says, how can I, a convert, when I sit down to say grace after meals, benching, how can I say, Eretz Shinchalta Lavotenu, the land that you gave to our fathers? It was not my fathers didn't get the land. How can I stand in the silent prayer and say, Elokeinu ve'Elokei Avotenu, our God and the God of our fathers? How can I say that? He says, how can I say any of the prayers that you say? Is it not a lie? How can I say that you commanded us and commanded my forefathers, that you gave us the land of Israel? You hear his question? If you're a convert, how can you pray from our prayer book? You read the prayer book, there's hundreds of references to our fathers, our ancestors, you gave us the land, they gave us... He says, I can't say that. Maimonides says, yes, you can say that. 100%. And he says, you know why? Isaiah says, let not the foreigners who has joined himself to God say, God will utterly separate me from his people. There is no difference between us and you in any matter. You should say the blessing who has chosen us, who has given us the Torah, who has separated us. Why, he says? Because he says, and he goes on to say, you should be aware, most of our ancestors who came out of Egypt were actually idol worshippers. They assimilated amongst the nations and learned from their actions until God, Holy One, blessed be, he took us out. And he separated us from the nations and brought us under the wings of the divine presence, us and all converts, and gave us Torah. He says, all Jews are converts. Why? Because before we came to Mount Sinai, what were we? Nomad, pagans, etc. We were descended from Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, yes, but we weren't technically Jewish. When did we become Jewish? At a mass conversion at Mount Sinai. So every single Jew is a descendant of a convert, either earlier or later. So either I'm a descendant of a Khazaria convert from the 9th century, or I'm a descendant from a Jewish convert from 3,300 years ago at Mount Sinai. And Maimonides says, he says this, although we trace our ancestry back to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, you trace yourself back to the Creator who spoke and created the world. He says, I'll just put it in Hebrew for the Hebrew speakers here, because it's very beautiful. He says, Al yehei yichuscha kal be'einecha. Don't let your ancestry be light in your eyes. She'anachnu mityachsim la'Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. We trace ourselves back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Ve'atam mityaches l'misha amar v'haya ha'olam. And you trace yourself back to he who spoke and created the world. Maimonides is a very beautiful letter, which is not written in Arabic, it's written in Hebrew. That's the original language of Maimonides that I'm quoting. And he writes, that is not what Judaism is about. It's not ethnicity. It is not DNA. And it's not even ancestry. It's being part of the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and with the whole Jewish people. That's how he puts it. And so therefore, it is fascinating to see the origin of the Jewish people amongst the Khazars. It is fascinating to see that yes, there were these Khazars who converted to Judaism, and it's a fascinating subject to look into. And I recommend a couple of books on this. The two best books on it are by Kevin Allen Brooke, called The Jews of Khazaria, and Dunlop, The History of the Jewish Khazars. both very good books. This is more recent. And then Rabbi Daniel Korobkin, which is the translation I mentioned before, has... it's a fairly recent, 2010 was published. He's got a brief history of the Khazars in the book there, and it's very well annotated. So anyway, that's a little bit of an introduction to the book, the Kuzari, and to the Khazars. I'll just mention one idea from the Kuzari, from his book, which I think is pertinent to what we just ended with. You see, it's interesting. He says, I believe in the God who took us out of Egypt and gave us the Torah, took us through the Sinai desert, gave us the Torah, gave us the land of Israel. So when the rabbi says this to the king, because you see, the Christian said, I believe in the God who created the world. And the Muslim says, I believe in God who created the world. The Jew says, I believe in God who took us out of Egypt, took us through the desert and gave us the Torah and the land of Israel. So the king says, originally I didn't want to ask the Jews, because I figured you guys have suffered so much from exile, you've lost all your original wisdom. He says, and I see I was right. Because instead of telling me you believe in God who created the universe, you're referring to some minor event to one people in the middle of history. It's like a totally ethnocentric. Right? I mean, can you imagine? Do you hear what the king is saying? He's saying, I see, obviously, exile has taken away the wisdom of the Jews. Right? You don't know what you're talking about. You come along, can you imagine, you're at Guggenheim Museum. Who designed the Guggenheim? Frank Lloyd Wright. So you're standing there. It so happened that you knew Frank when he was an architecture student, and he remodeled your basement for you. So you have an early Frank Lloyd Wright basement. So you're standing in the building, you're at a cocktail party at some art exhibition, and someone comes over to you and says, G'day Mordechai, how are you? I said, G'day mate. He says, who's your mate here? I said, this is Frank Lloyd Wright. He says, Frank Lloyd Wright, the name sounds familiar. He says, my basement. The guy did my basement. And he says, oh, yeah, nice job. I love that. I love the bathroom. It's awesome. Right? Now, do you think Frank would be a little upset? You're standing in this magnificent Guggenheim Museum, and instead of introducing him as the designer of this museum, I'm saying he's the guy who did my basement. So the king is upset at the rabbi. Instead of telling me, like the Christian and the Muslim did, I believe in God who created space, time, and everything. I believe, what you're saying, I believe in the God who took me and my ancestors out of Egypt, gave us the Torah and the land of Israel. Isn't that strange? So the rabbi's answer, the Rabbi Yehuda Levi's answer is fantastic. He says this. He says, there was no one around for the creation of the universe. He says, not only was there no one around, he says, but you can't even imagine the creation of the universe. Even the greatest scientist, philosopher, and Kabbalist cannot wrap his mind around creation of the universe. He says, it's not something that speaks to me, it's not something that obligates me, and it's not something that I can relate to. He says, on the other hand, he says, my ancestors experienced the exodus from Egypt. My ancestors experienced the revelation of Sinai. My ancestors entered the land of Israel and lived there for thousands of years till we were thrown out by the Babylonians and then the Romans, etc., etc. He says, these are things which A, I can relate to, B, speak specifically to me, C, were experienced by my ancestors. He says, and not only can I imagine them, but some of them I can actually verify. He said, therefore, I didn't introduce myself as one who believes in the God who created the universe, because that's not a specifically Jewish thing. He says that's beyond me. He says I introduced God to you in a much more meaningful, experiential way. And Rabbi Yehuda Levi says that's what the Torah is about. He says, so when we celebrate the Passover Seder, we're not celebrating something which is beyond time, space, and humanity. It's a very real thing. We got out of slavery. We were slaves, we got out of slavery. It's a very real thing. We eat matzah, the food that the Jews ate back then. We have the maror, the bitter herbs. We drink cups of wine. We feel giddy with freedom, and so on and so forth. We read the Megillah. Read the Megillah Esther. We call the festival Purim. And you can see, go to the Yale University Library in Connecticut, and you can see a pur. You can see a pur. They have a pur there from the time of Haman. It's a dice, a Persian dice called a pur. Our festival's called Purim. This is not stuff from another planet far, far away in a different galaxy. This is stuff that actually happen in history. We have artifacts and so on and so forth. He says that's the beauty. That's what Rabbi Levi's great principle is that he's mentioning in his book. And he develops an idea throughout the book that our relationship to God is not a relationship to God which is a philosophical relationship. Most people are not philosophers. He says not a relationship to God which is a scientific relationship. Right, the God particle, etc., which is actually a misnomer. It's really the goddamn particle, but someone abbreviated it. But okay, whatever. Those who are interested, the Higgs boson doesn't matter. Anyway, but again, it's not. He says it's not that type of relationship. You know what is our relationship with God is a very personal, experiential, living relationship. It's we know Him, He knows us. We've had a relationship throughout history. We continue that relationship. And that's what the book, the Kuzari, discusses. And the Khazar people, this Turkic people in Azerbaijan area, etc., who entered into the covenant became as Jewish as any one of you and I. Because that's what it means to be Jewish, to enter into that covenant. And so therefore, that's what the book, the Kuzari, hopefully, you'll all pick up a copy at some point. You can borrow it. I'm not selling it. I don't get any money out of it, right? But pick up a copy, study the book, read the book. It's been translated into English. You can get it in Ivrit. You can get it in French. You can get it in many languages. I think there's a Yiddish translation for those who are interested, etc. And those who like the original Arabic, I'm sure that's available. Probably not as available as the other translations. But anyway, that's it for this evening. Thank you very much for listening. We'll see you.